They thought their children would care for them in their final years, but instead Harold and Margaret were betrayed, stripped of everything, and left to die alone in a cut-rate nursing home. With nowhere else to turn, this elderly couple made one desperate choice: break into the off-limits mountain facility where Harold once worked, a place sealed by the government for over 25 years. What they found hidden 3 stories beneath the concrete would expose a $285 million secret that powerful people had buried and forgotten, and it would change everything. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The mountain town of Pine Ridge, Colorado, sat tucked between granite peaks that turned purple at sunset and white with snow by October. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, where the diner served the same meatloaf special every Thursday, and where people still waved from their porches when you drove past. Harold and Margaret had lived there for 47 years, raised 3 children in a modest 2-story house with blue shutters and a garden Margaret tended every spring. The house wasn't much, but it was theirs, paid off after decades of careful saving and sacrifice. Harold was 71 now, tall and lean with silver hair he still combed straight back like he did in his Air Force days. His hands were weathered, marked with old scars from a lifetime of work, but they were steady. He'd spent 33 years as a senior technician at a classified government research facility built into the mountains 15 miles outside town. He never talked much about what he did there. Margaret knew it was something important, something sensitive, but Harold had signed papers promising silence, and he kept his promises. That was the kind of man he was. Margaret, 69, still moved with grace despite the arthritis that had begun settling into her knees. She'd been a nurse for 41 years, working double shifts at Pine Ridge General Hospital, delivering babies, holding the hands of the dying, never complaining about the long hours or the heartbreak that came with caring too much. Her hair had gone completely white 5 years ago, and she wore it in a neat bun that made her look dignified, strong. When she smiled, her whole face lit up, but these days she didn't smile as often. They had 3 children: Daniel, the oldest at 46, who worked in real estate in Denver; Christine, 43, a corporate lawyer in Boulder; and Robert, 39, who managed a construction company in Colorado Springs. All successful, all busy, all distant. The children had moved away years ago, and visits became rare. Birthdays got forgotten. Phone calls went unreturned. Harold and Margaret told themselves their kids were just living their lives, building their own families, chasing their own dreams. But deep down, it hurt. The silence hurt more than they ever admitted to each other. Then one spring, everything changed. Daniel called on a Tuesday evening. Harold was in the garage tinkering with an old radio, and Margaret was making soup on the stove when the phone rang. She wiped her hands and answered, surprised to hear her son's voice. "Mom," Daniel said, his tone unusually warm. "How are you and Dad doing?" Margaret's heart lifted. "We're good, honey. Your father's in the garage. Should I get him?" "Actually, I wanted to talk to both of you. Can you put me on speaker?" Harold came in, oil on his fingers, eyebrows raised. Margaret hit the speaker button. "Hi, Dad," Daniel said. "Son," Harold replied cautiously. "Listen, Christine and Robert and I have been talking. We're worried about you both. You're getting older, and that house, it's a lot to maintain. The stairs, the yard work, the winter heating bills." Margaret glanced at Harold. "We're managing fine," she said softly. I know. But we've been thinking, maybe it's time to consider something easier, something safer. There's a really nice assisted living community in Denver. Christine looked into it. You'd have your own apartment, meals provided, activities, medical staff on site." Harold's jaw tightened. "We don't need assisted living." "Dad, it's not about need, it's about being smart. And here's the thing, if you sold the house now, you could use that money for a comfortable place. The market's good. We could help you through the whole process." Margaret felt something twist in her stomach. Sell the house? Just think about it, Daniel said, his voice smooth. We love you. We want you safe. They hung up, and Margaret and Harold stood in the kitchen, the soup forgotten on the stove. Over the next 2 weeks, all 3 children called, separately, but with the same message. The house was too much. They were worried. Assisted living made sense. They could help. They wanted to be involved. Harold and Margaret, worn down by years of loneliness and desperate to reconnect with their children, began to soften. Maybe the kids were right. Maybe they were being stubborn. When Christine drove up for a surprise visit with glossy brochures and warm hugs, Margaret cried. When Robert showed up the following weekend with his wife and kids, Harold felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The children were attentive, caring, present. For the first time in decades, the house felt full again. Laughter echoed through the rooms. Grandchildren ran through the hallways. Harold and Margaret felt seen, loved, wanted. We just need you to sign some papers, Christine explained one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with documents spread out. It's a trust. Puts the house in our names temporarily so we can handle the sale for you. You won't have to worry about anything. We'll take care of everything. Margaret hesitated. Why does it need to be in your names? It's just easier, Mum. Tax purposes, legal stuff. You know how complicated real estate can be. Trust us. We're doing this because we love you. Harold looked at his daughter's face, so earnest, so familiar. He looked at Daniel and Robert nodding in agreement. He thought about the years of distance, the years of silence, and here they were, finally stepping up. He signed. Margaret signed. The children smiled. 2 weeks later, the house sold. Not to a family, but to a development company. The price was substantial, $375,000. Harold and Margaret were told the money would be held in trust for their care. They were moved to a facility outside Denver, not the nice one from the brochures. This place smelled like disinfectant and overcooked cabbage. The rooms were small, the staff overworked and underpaid. The activities consisted of bingo in a fluorescent-lit common room and occasional visits from a chaplain nobody wanted to see. Harold and Margaret shared a single room with 2 narrow beds, a shared bathroom, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. It's temporary, Daniel said when he dropped them off, just until we find you something better. He didn't visit again. Christine stopped answering their calls. Robert sent a text message. Really busy with work. We'll try to come by soon. He never did. When Harold asked about the money from the house sale, Christine sent an email. Cold, legal, impersonal. The funds were being managed. There were fees, expenses, legal complications. They'd get a full accounting soon. They never did. 3 months passed. Harold's savings account, once carefully maintained with over $42,000, was drained. Margaret's pension checks were being redirected. When Harold called the bank, he was told the accounts had been legally transferred to a trust managed by his children. "But we didn't authorize that," Harold said, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry, sir. The paperwork is all in order. You'll need to speak with your family." His family wouldn't speak to him. Harold sat on his narrow bed, hands trembling, staring at the yellowed ceiling tiles. Margaret sat beside him, her face hollow, eyes vacant. "They took everything," she whispered. Harold couldn't speak. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, it felt like a physical weight crushing his chest. Their children, the ones they'd sacrificed everything for, had stolen their home, their savings, their dignity. They'd been discarded like broken tools, left in this terrible place to fade away quietly. For weeks, Harold barely ate. Margaret stopped going to the common room. They sat together in silence, holding hands, too broken to even cry. Then one night, Harold woke suddenly. Margaret was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and steady. He stared at the cracked ceiling and thought about his life. He thought about his years in the Air Force, fixing radar systems in Korea. He thought about the decades he spent at the mountain facility, working on projects he still couldn't talk about. He thought about Margaret, his wife of 45 years, who'd worked double shifts to help pay for the kids' college, who'd never once complained. And he thought about the facility. The old research complex, built deep into Granite Peak in 1972. He'd started working there in 1976, fresh out of the service, eager and young. The facility was massive, a sprawling concrete fortress buried inside the mountain. Classified work, advanced materials research, things that were supposed to change the world. But the Cold War ended. Budgets shifted. Priorities changed. The facility was decommissioned in 1998. Harold had been there the day they sealed it, watched as crews shut down the power, locked the blast doors, strung razor wire across the access roads. They'd given him a severance package, a handshake, and a warning never to speak about what happened inside those walls. He'd kept his security badge, an old habit. It was in a shoebox in their storage unit, along with the few belongings they'd been allowed to keep. Harold sat up slowly, careful not to wake Margaret. An idea was forming, desperate and wild, but it was something. They had nowhere else to go. No money, no family, nothing. But he had keys to a place nobody remembered. In the morning, he told Margaret his plan. She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "We have nothing left to lose," she said quietly. Harold checked them out of the facility that afternoon. The staff barely looked up. Nobody cared where two forgotten old people went. They took a bus to the storage unit, gathered their few boxes, and called a taxi. The driver looked confused when Harold gave him the address. "That's up in the mountains, sir. Nothing up there but old government land." "I know," Harold said. The drive took 90 minutes. The taxi climbed winding roads, past pine forests and granite cliffs. The driver kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the elderly couple in the back seat, quiet and grim. Finally, they reached a rusted gate. A faded sign read, "Restricted area, no trespassing, authorized personnel only." "This is it?" the driver asked. Harold nodded, paid him with the last of their cash, and stepped out. Margaret followed, her small suitcase heavy in her hand. The taxi drove away, leaving them alone on the empty mountain road. Harold approached the gate. It was chained shut, locked with a heavy padlock, but the fence, built decades ago, had rusted. He found a section where the metal had corroded through and pulled it aside. They slipped through. The access road was cracked and overgrown with weeds. They walked slowly, Margaret's breath coming harder in the thin mountain air. Harold held her arm, steadying her. After half a mile, the facility came into view. It was massive, a brutalist concrete structure built directly into the mountainside, like a tumor growing from the rock. Tall guard towers stood empty. Razor wire, rusted and sagging, coiled across the perimeter. Warning signs, faded but still legible, dotted the chain-link fence. Danger. Restricted area. Use of deadly force authorized. But there were no guards, no patrols, nothing. The place had been abandoned for 26 years, and the world had forgotten it existed. Harold led Margaret to a side entrance, a reinforced steel door he'd used thousands of times during his years here. He pulled out his old security badge, the laminated card with his photo from 1997. Younger, hopeful. The card reader beside the door was dark, no power, but beside it was a manual override, a keyhole. Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key, tarnished and old. He'd never turned it in. The key slid into the lock. He turned it. Something inside the mechanism clicked. The door's pneumatic seal hissed, and the heavy steel panel swung inward. Cold, stale air rushed out. Harold looked at Margaret. Her face was pale, frightened but determined. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes," she said. They stepped inside. The door closed behind them with a dull thud that echoed through the darkness. Harold pulled out a flashlight, clicked it on. The beam cut through the black, illuminating a long concrete corridor. Dust hung thick in the air. Their footsteps echoed. They walked slowly, Harold leading the way, Margaret close behind. The facility was exactly as he remembered: cold, utilitarian, built for function, not comfort. Doors lined the hallway, each marked with faded labels: supply room, communications, administration. Harold's flashlight beam swept across a doorway marked break room. He pushed it open. Inside, the tables and chairs were still there, covered in dust. A coffee pot sat on the counter, dried residue crusted at the bottom. A calendar hung on the wall, still turned to November 1998. It was like the people had just walked away mid-shift and never returned. Margaret sat heavily in one of the chairs, exhausted from the walk. Harold found a storage closet and pulled out old blankets, still sealed in plastic. He shook them out, dust flying, and draped one around her shoulders. "We can't stay here," Margaret said quietly. "Just for tonight," Harold replied. "Just until we figure out what to do." But they both knew the truth. They had nowhere else to go. Harold explored the facility while Margaret rested. He moved through the corridors, his flashlight illuminating rooms frozen in time. He found his old office, the door still marked with a nameplate: Harold, Senior Technician. Inside, papers still sat on the desk. A photo of Margaret and the kids, young and smiling, sat in a cracked frame. He picked it up, stared at their faces, and felt the grief wash over him again. His children. The ones he'd worked 70-hour weeks to provide for. The ones he'd missed Little League games and ballet recitals for because he was underground in this mountain, doing work he believed mattered. And they'd thrown him away. Harold set the photo down and kept walking. He moved deeper into the facility, past the laboratories, past the testing chambers, past the vault-like doors that led to the restricted sections. Most areas had been stripped during decommissioning. Equipment removed, files shredded, anything valuable hauled away. But as he walked, something nagged at him. He stopped in front of a large wall map, a schematic of the entire facility. He'd studied this map 1,000 times during his years here. He knew every corridor, every room. But now, looking at it with older eyes, he saw something he'd never noticed before: a discrepancy. The map showed 3 levels: ground, sub-level 1, sub-level 2. But when he counted the elevator stops, there were 4 buttons. He'd never questioned it before. Just assumed the 4th button was for maintenance or some administrative quirk. But now, standing in the abandoned darkness, he wondered. Harold made his way back to the break room. Margaret was asleep in the chair, wrapped in the musty blanket. He didn't wake her. Instead, he sat down and thought. For 33 years, he'd worked in this facility. He'd been cleared for sensitive projects. He'd signed documents, attended briefings, followed protocols. But he'd never been told about a 4th level. As the night deepened and the mountain winds howled outside the concrete walls, Harold made a decision. Tomorrow, he would find out what was down there. The morning light filtered weakly through the facility's small, reinforced windows. Harold woke stiff and cold on the break room floor where he'd finally dozed off around 3 in the morning. Margaret was already awake, sitting at the dusty table, hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. "Good morning," Harold said softly. She turned to him, her eyes tired. "Is it?" He didn't have an answer for that. They ate granola bars Harold had packed in his bag, washing them down with water from their canteens. The facility's plumbing still worked, surprisingly, fed by mountain springs. The water ran brown at first, then clear and cold. After their meager breakfast, Harold told Margaret what he'd noticed on the map. "There's a 4th level," he said. "I think it was classified above my clearance." Margaret looked at him. "And you want to go down there?" "I want to know what it is." "Harold, we're trespassing in a government facility. If they find us here—" "Nobody's coming," Harold interrupted gently. "This place has been forgotten for over 2 decades. We're ghosts, Margaret. Ghosts in a ghost building." She was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. What do we have to lose? They made their way through the corridors, Harold's flashlight leading the way. The facility felt different in daylight, less ominous, but more sad. Every room told a story of abandonment, of work interrupted, of people who'd moved on to other projects, other lives. They reached the central elevator shaft. The doors were closed, the call button dark. Harold pried open the panel beside it, exposing the manual release. He pulled the lever, and with a groan of metal, the doors slid apart. Inside, the elevator car sat waiting, covered in dust but intact. Harold examined the control panel. 4 buttons, just like he remembered. Ground, S1, S2, and at the bottom, unmarked, a 4th button. "There's no power," Margaret said. Harold nodded. But he'd worked in this facility long enough to know about backup systems. He moved to a utility panel in the hallway, opened it, and found what he was looking for: emergency power controls. The facility was built for continuity of operations, he explained. Even in a nuclear event, critical systems were supposed to stay online. He threw a series of switches. Somewhere deep in the mountain, something rumbled to life. Lights flickered in the hallway, dim but steady. The elevator control panel glowed. Margaret's eyes widened. "It still works?" "Some of it," Harold said. They stepped into the elevator. Harold pressed the unmarked 4th button. Nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. "It needs authorization," Margaret said. Harold thought back to his years here, to the security protocols, the access codes. Most of them changed regularly, but there were master codes, emergency overrides that remained constant. He tried the general override, 1776. Nothing. He tried his old employee code, 44928. Nothing. Margaret watched him, patient. Maybe it's not meant to be opened. Harold stared at the button, frustration building. Then he remembered something. The last day. The day they sealed the facility. He'd been in the director's office, helping pack files. The director, a man named Thomas, had been on the phone, agitated. "The secondary vault protocols remain active," Thomas had said. "Authorization code Charlie 77 Oscar 903. Harold had filed it away in his memory, not knowing what it meant. Now, with trembling fingers, he entered the code on the elevator's keypad, C77093. The elevator shuddered. Then, with a mechanical groan, it began to descend. Margaret grabbed Harold's arm. The car moved slowly, creaking, dropping past sub-level 1, past sub-level 2, continuing down into the mountain. The descent lasted 45 seconds. When the elevator finally stopped, the doors slid open. Cold air rushed in, much colder than the upper levels. Their breath formed small clouds. They stepped out into a corridor unlike anything above. This wasn't rough concrete. The walls here were polished, the floor reinforced with metal plating. Everything was clean, preserved, as if time had stopped. Harold's flashlight swept across a sign. "Authorized personnel only. Section Omega clearance required." They walked forward cautiously. The corridor opened into a massive chamber, and Harold stopped so suddenly that Margaret bumped into him. "Oh my God," she whispered. The chamber was enormous, carved directly from the mountain rock, 3 stories tall and the length of a football field. Rows of large containers lined the floor, each one labeled and numbered. The air was climate-controlled, cool and dry. Harold approached the nearest container. It was roughly the size of a car, made of reinforced steel, sealed with heavy locks. A label on the side read, RMR001. Critical Materials Reserve. His hands shook as he worked the lock. It was old but well-maintained, lubricated, protected from the elements. It opened. Inside, packed in foam and protective material, were ingots of refined metal, dark grey and incredibly dense. A smaller label identified it. Platinum. 99.95% pure. Weight. 200 kilograms. Margaret stood beside him, staring. Harold moved to the next container. Inside, gold ingots neatly stacked, gleaming even in the flashlight's beam. Another container, palladium. Another, rare earth elements precisely measured and stored. Another, rhodium, iridium, osmium, metals Harold recognized from his years working with advanced materials. They walked deeper into the vault, opening container after container. Each one held strategic materials, resources stockpiled during the Cold War for emergency use. Materials that were supposed to be transferred or liquidated when the facility closed. But they hadn't been. They'd been forgotten. Near the back of the vault, Harold found something else. A desk, an old metal office desk with a chair. On it sat a leather binder, thick and official-looking. He opened it. Inside was a manifest, a complete inventory of everything stored in the vault. Each item listed with specifications, weight, purity, acquisition date, and estimated value. Harold flipped to the last page, his eyes scanning the columns until he found it. Total estimated current market value, as of October 1998, $212,600,000. Margaret leaned over his shoulder, reading the same words. That's... She couldn't finish. Harold's mind raced. October 1998 was when the facility closed. That was 26 years ago. Rare earth metals, platinum, gold, all of these materials had increased dramatically in value since then. He sat down heavily in the chair, Margaret beside him. On the desk was another document, a memorandum stamped classified. Harold read it aloud, his voice shaking. To Facility Director, from Department of Energy, Asset Management Division, Subject, Decommission Protocol, Section Omega Materials Reserve. The materials stored in Section Omega are to be transferred to Fort Knox Reserve Facility upon facility closure. Transfer authorization pending final budgetary approval. Estimated transfer date, March 1999. Until transfer, materials remain under existing security protocols. Custodial Authority, Senior Facility Staff with Omega clearance. Harold set the memo down. They were supposed to transfer everything in March 99, he said. But the facility closed in November 98. Someone dropped the ball. The transfer never happened. Margaret looked around the vast chamber, and nobody came back for it. Government reorganization, Harold said. The Cold War ended. Agencies merged. Projects got cancelled. Files were lost. People retired. Nobody remembered this was here. They sat in silence, the weight of discovery pressing down on them. Finally, Margaret spoke. Harold, this is government property. Technically, yes. We can't just take it. Harold looked at her, his face hard. Our children took everything from us. The government abandoned this 26 years ago. We have nothing, Margaret, nothing. But is it right? Harold stood, walked to the edge of the vault, stared at the rows of containers. I gave 33 years to this facility. I was cleared for Omega Section. That memo says custodial authority remains with senior facility staff with Omega clearance. You think that means you? I don't know what it means, Harold admitted. But I know we have two choices. We can walk away, go back to that terrible facility where our children dumped us, and wait to die. Or we can fight. Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she stood, walked to him, and took his hand. Then we fight, she said. They spent the rest of the day exploring the vault, documenting everything they found. Harold used an old camera from the facility's supply room, taking photos of the containers, the manifest, the memorandum. Margaret found something else. A small office attached to the vault, with filing cabinets full of documents. Transfer orders that were never executed, budget authorizations that were never approved, correspondence between departments that had since been dissolved. It was a paper trail of bureaucratic failure. That night, they slept in the vault office, wrapped in blankets they'd brought down from above. The air was cold but clean. The silence was absolute. Harold lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what came next. They couldn't just load up platinum ingots and drive away. This was government property, abandoned or not. They needed legal counsel, documentation, some kind of legitimate claim. But more than that, they needed to be smart. Their children had used the law to steal from them. Maybe Harold and Margaret could use the law to take back their lives. As Margaret slept beside him, Harold made a decision. In the morning, he would find a phone, call a lawyer, and start building a case. They had stumbled onto something massive, something that could change everything. But first, they had to survive long enough to claim it. Harold woke before dawn, his back aching from sleeping on the floor of the vault office. Margaret was still asleep, her breathing soft and steady in the darkness. He stood carefully, trying not to disturb her, and walked out into the main vault chamber. The emergency lights cast everything in a pale yellow glow. Rows of containers stretched into the shadows like silent sentinels. Harold moved between them, his footsteps echoing off the rock walls. Each container represented something: security, possibility, a future his children had tried to steal. He stopped at container RMR-017 and opened it again. Inside, nestled in protective foam, were cylinders of refined rhodium, one of the rarest metals on Earth. The label indicated 400 troy ounces. Harold knew rhodium was trading at over $14,000 per ounce now. This single container held nearly $6 million worth, and there were 73 more containers. Margaret appeared behind him, wrapped in one of the old blankets. "Couldn't sleep?" "Thinking," Harold said. "About what?" "About how we got here. About the choices we made." He closed the container. "We trusted them, Margaret. We trusted our children because that's what parents do. And they used that trust to destroy us." Margaret stepped beside him, her hand finding his. "We're not destroyed yet." Harold looked at her, this woman he'd loved for 45 years. Her face was lined now, weathered by time and recent heartbreak, but her eyes were still sharp, still fierce. "No," he agreed, "we're not." They spent the morning making a complete inventory. Margaret found notebooks in the office and began cataloguing every container while Harold cross-referenced the manifest. The work was slow, methodical, but it gave them purpose. By noon, they had documented everything: 218,000 troy ounces of platinum, 94,000 troy ounces of gold, 167,000 troy ounces of palladium, substantial quantities of rhodium, iridium, osmium, rhenium, and various rare earth elements critical for advanced technology. Margaret did the math on an old calculator they found in the desk. At current market prices, the total value exceeded $285 million. She set the calculator down, hands shaking. "Harold, this is real." "I know. What are we going to do?" Harold walked to the filing cabinets and pulled out the documents they'd found the previous night. He spread them across the desk: transfer orders, authorization forms, inter-agency correspondence, all from 1998 and 99. "The facility closed in November 98, he said, pointing to one document. But the asset transfer was scheduled for March 99. Here's where it gets interesting. The Department of Energy was supposed to coordinate the transfer, but in January 99, the entire Advanced Materials Division was reorganized and folded into a different agency. Margaret followed his finger across the pages. So the transfer got lost in bureaucracy? Not just lost, forgotten. The new agency had no record of Section Omega. The old agency assumed the transfer had been completed. These materials fell through the cracks. But they must have records somewhere. Harold pulled out another document. This is a decommission certificate, signed by the facility director and a DOE inspector. It says all sensitive materials have been removed or secured according to protocol. But look at this. He pointed to a checkbox. Section Omega is listed as N/A, not applicable. Why would it be not applicable? Because Omega clearance was above the inspector's level. He wasn't cleared to know it existed. So he marked it not applicable and signed off. The director, Thomas, he knew, but he retired 6 months later, died in 2003. Margaret sat down slowly. So there's no one left who knows this is here, except me. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Margaret asked the question that had been hanging between them. What gives us the right to claim any of this? Harold pulled out the memorandum they'd found the day before. Custodial authority remains with senior facility staff with Omega clearance. I was senior facility staff. I had Omega clearance, even if I didn't fully understand what that meant at the time. That's not a legal claim, Harold. That's a bureaucratic footnote. Maybe, but it's more than we had yesterday. Harold stood and walked to the window of the vault office, a small rectangular opening that looked out over the main chamber. I've been thinking about something. When the facility closed, they gave me a severance package. 33 years of service, and they gave me $42,000 and a handshake. No pension beyond my Air Force benefits. No health insurance. Nothing. Margaret joined him at the window. You never complained. Because I thought that's just how it was. You work your whole life. You get what they give you, and you're grateful. His voice hardened. But they took everything. The government forgot about $285 million in strategic materials. And our children, the ones we sacrificed everything for, they stole our home, our savings, our dignity. He turned to face her. I'm not stealing this, Margaret. I'm claiming compensation for a lifetime of service to a government that abandoned these assets. I'm claiming restitution for what our family took from us. I'm claiming what we're owed. Margaret's eyes were wet. And if they say no? Then we'll have tried, but at least we'll have stood up and fought. Over the next 3 days, Harold and Margaret transformed the vault office into a makeshift home. They brought down supplies from the upper levels, more blankets, preserved rations from the emergency storage, even an old coffee maker that Harold got working after cleaning out decades of dust. The facility's backup power held steady, fed by geothermal systems that required no maintenance. Water from the mountain springs was clean and cold. They had heat from the climate control systems designed to protect the materials. For the first time since their children's betrayal, they had shelter, resources, and something close to peace. Harold spent hours reading through the documents, building his understanding of what had happened. The more he learned, the clearer it became. This wasn't just bureaucratic oversight. This was institutional failure on a massive scale. Section Omega had been a black-budget project funded through classified channels. When the Cold War ended and transparency initiatives began, projects like Omega were quietly shut down. The materials were supposed to be consolidated into the National Strategic Reserve. But Omega was so classified that even the consolidation teams didn't know about it. The people who did know either retired, moved on, or died. The paperwork got filed in archives that were later digitized poorly or not at all. The result? $285 million in critical materials sitting forgotten in a mountain vault for 26 years. Margaret found something else in the files. A personnel roster from 1997. Harold's name was there, listed as one of only 7 people with Omega-level clearance. Of those 7, 5 were dead. One, a woman named Patricia, had moved to Montana and hadn't been heard from in years. Harold was the last one left. You really were the custodian, Margaret said, looking at the roster. You're the only person alive who remembers this place exists. Harold stared at his name on the faded page. Senior Technician Harold. Omega clearance. Custodial authority active. Then I have a responsibility, he said quietly. On the 4th day, Harold made his way back to the surface. They needed to make contact with the outside world, and the facility's communications had been shut down long ago. Margaret stayed below, documenting everything with the camera. Harold climbed the access road to the perimeter fence. His truck was still parked where they'd hidden it in the trees, covered with branches and pine needles. He drove into town to a library in a small mountain community 40 minutes away. The librarian, a young woman with kind eyes, helped him set up at a computer. Harold's hands shook as he typed searches. Abandoned government property claims, custodial authority federal facilities, whistleblower protections. What he found was both encouraging and terrifying. There were laws protecting federal whistleblowers. There were provisions for claiming abandoned property under certain circumstances. There were even cases where individuals had successfully fought the government over forgotten assets, but there were also stories of people who'd been crushed by the weight of federal prosecution, of lives destroyed for challenging the system. Harold printed everything he could, spending money they could barely afford on copies. Then he searched for lawyers specializing in federal property law and whistleblower cases. He found one. David Chen, a lawyer based in Denver with a reputation for taking on difficult cases against government agencies. His website showed a list of victories: improper asset seizures overturned, whistleblower protections enforced, bureaucratic injustices corrected. Harold wrote down the number. Back at the facility, he showed Margaret what he'd found. They sat together in the vault office, reading through the printouts by the light of the emergency lamps. "This David Chen," Margaret said. "You think he'll help us?" "I don't know, but we have to try." "And if he says it's hopeless?" Harold looked around the vault, at the containers holding materials worth more than most people would see in 100 lifetimes. "Then at least we'll know." The next morning, Harold drove back into town and called David Chen from a payphone. It rang 4 times before a receptionist answered. "Chen and Associates? How may I direct your call?" Harold's throat was dry. "I need to speak with David Chen. It's about a federal property matter." "Mr. Chen is in court this morning. Can I take a message?" Harold hesitated. "How did you explain something like this in a message?" "Tell him it's urgent. Tell him it involves abandoned government assets worth over $285 million. There was a pause. "I'm sorry, did you say million?" "Yes, and tell him I'm the last living person with custodial authority." "Sir, can I have your name and number?" Harold gave her the payphone number and his name. "I'll wait," he said. He stood by the phone for 2 hours. Tourists and locals passed by, going about their normal lives. Harold stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the phone like it might disappear. Finally, it rang. Harold grabbed it. "Hello? This is David Chen. I got a very interesting message from my office. You want to tell me what this is about?" Harold took a deep breath and began talking. He told David about the facility, about his 33 years of service, about the vault, the manifest, the bureaucratic failure. He spoke for 20 minutes straight while David listened in silence. When Harold finished, there was a long pause. "Mr. Harold," David finally said, "are you telling me you found a classified government facility that's been abandoned for over 20 years, containing hundreds of millions in strategic materials that nobody knows about?" "Yes." "And you believe you have a legal claim to these materials based on a custodial authority designation from 1997? "Yes." Another pause. "This is either the most important case I'll ever handle or you're completely insane." "I have documentation, photos, the original manifest, transfer orders that were never executed." "Can you bring them to my office?" "When?" "Tomorrow, 9 in the morning." Harold's heart raced. "I'll be there." He drove back to the facility, his mind spinning. Margaret met him at the entrance, worry written across her face. "Well?" she asked. "We have a meeting tomorrow, in Denver." That night, they barely slept. Harold kept going over everything in his mind, rehearsing what he would say, how he would explain. Margaret organized the documents, creating a timeline of events, a chain of custody for the materials. They worked until 3 in the morning, then collapsed in exhaustion. At 6, they were awake again. Harold showered in the facility's old locker room, the water ice cold but clean. He put on the only decent clothes he had. slacks and a button-down shirt Margaret had ironed using an iron she found in the supply room. Margaret wore a simple dress, her white hair pulled back neatly. They looked at each other in the dim light of the vault office. "We look respectable," Margaret said. "We look scared," Harold replied. "That too." They gathered the documents into a briefcase Harold had found in the administrative offices. Manifest, memorandum, transfer orders, personnel rosters, photos of the vault, everything. The drive to Denver took 3 hours. They didn't talk much, just held hands across the center console of the old truck. The mountains gave way to foothills, then to the sprawl of the city. David Chen's office was in a modern building downtown. Harold and Margaret stood in the parking garage for 5 minutes, gathering courage. "Whatever happens," Harold said, "we tried." "We did more than try," Margaret replied. "We survived." They rode the elevator to the 7th floor. The receptionist, the same woman Harold had spoken to on the phone, looked up with surprise. These weren't the kind of clients who usually walked into Chen and Associates. Most were corporate whistleblowers or wealthy individuals fighting the IRS. Harold and Margaret looked like what they were, 2 elderly people who'd been through hell and somehow found their way back. "Mr. Harold?" the receptionist asked. "Yes. Mr. Chen is ready for you." David Chen was younger than Harold expected, maybe 45, with sharp eyes and an intensity that filled the room. He stood when they entered, shook both their hands and gestured to chairs. "Please, sit. Can I get you coffee? Water?" "Water," Margaret said softly. David poured 2 glasses from a pitcher on his desk, then sat down across from them. "Before we begin, I need to be clear about something. What you described on the phone is extraordinary. If it's true, it could be one of the most significant cases of government asset mismanagement in modern history. If it's not true, it could be a serious federal crime." Harold opened the briefcase. "It's true." He spread the documents across David's desk. The manifest, the memorandum, the photos. David leaned forward, his expression shifting from skepticism to fascination. He picked up the manifest, studied it, then grabbed the photos. His eyes widened. "These are real," he said. "Not a question, a realization." "Yes," Harold confirmed. David spent the next hour going through everything. He asked questions, took notes, cross-referenced documents. Finally, he sat back in his chair. "Okay, here's what we're dealing with. Legally, these materials are federal property, no question. But the question is whether they were properly managed and whether anyone has superior claim to custodial authority." "Can we make a case?" Margaret asked. "Possibly. The custodial authority designation is unusual, but not unprecedented. The fact that the transfer was never completed, that the decommission paperwork is incomplete, that the agency responsible no longer exists in its original form, all of this creates legal ambiguity." "What does that mean for us?" Harold asked. David leaned forward. "It means we have a window, not to claim ownership, you'll never own these materials outright, but to claim compensation for their discovery, recovery, and proper management. There are federal whistleblower laws that provide for rewards when individuals report government waste, fraud, or mismanagement. What happens next will turn this discovery into a legal battle that challenges the government itself, reveals corruption nobody expected, and reminds us that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is the truth. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. "How much compensation?" Margaret asked carefully. David pulled out a calculator. "Whistleblower rewards typically range from 10 to 30% of recovered assets. If we're talking about $285 million, even at 10%, that's $28 million. Harold and Margaret sat in stunned silence. "But," David continued, "there's risk, enormous risk. The government doesn't like being told they lost nearly $300 million. They'll fight. They'll investigate you. They'll look for any reason to claim you're in the wrong. "We have nothing left to lose," Harold said quietly. "Our children took everything. We're living in an abandoned facility because we have nowhere else to go." David's expression softened. "Tell me about that." And so they did. They told him about the betrayal, about the trust documents, about the house being sold, the savings drained. Margaret's voice broke when she described the nursing facility where they'd been dumped. When they finished, David was quiet. Then he stood, walked to his window, and looked out over the city. "I became a lawyer because I saw my father get crushed by a system that didn't care about people like him. He was a federal employee, worked for the Postal Service for 37 years. When he retired, they shorted his pension by $18,000 due to a clerical error. He spent 4 years fighting them, died before it was resolved." He turned back to Harold and Margaret. "I'll take your case, not for the money, though if we win, my fee will be substantial. I'll take it because what happened to you is exactly why I do this work." Harold felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been tight since the day his children betrayed him. "What's our first step?" he asked. "Documentation. We need everything verified by independent experts, metallurgists to confirm the materials, accountants to verify current market values, historians to establish the chain of custody, and we need to do it quietly before the government catches wind." "How long will that take?" "Months, maybe longer. Can you keep the facility secure that long?" Harold nodded. "No one knows we're there. No one knows it exists." "Good, keep it that way." Over the next 2 weeks, David assembled a team. He brought in a retired metallurgist named Patricia, ironically the same Patricia who'd worked at the facility years ago. She was 71 now, living in Montana, and when David explained what Harold had found, she broke down crying. "I helped stockpile some of those materials," she said during a video call. "I always wondered what happened to Omega Section." She agreed to travel to Colorado to verify the materials. David also hired Marcus, an accountant who specialized in commodity valuations, and brought in Thomas, a retired inspector general who understood federal asset management. Harold and Margaret led them into the facility on a cold morning in late autumn. The team descended into the vault, and their reactions mirrored Harold and Margaret's initial shock. "My God," Patricia whispered, running her hand along one of the containers. "It's all still here." They spent 3 days in the vault. Patricia tested samples, confirming purity and composition. Marcus catalogued everything, cross-referencing current market prices. Thomas photographed documentation, building a timeline of bureaucratic failure. On the 3rd night, they sat together in the vault office. Thomas spread out his findings. "This is extraordinary," he said. "I've investigated government waste for 30 years. I've never seen anything like this. The materials were properly acquired, properly stored, but completely forgotten during organizational transition. No fraud, no theft, just catastrophic mismanagement." "What's it worth?" David asked. Marcus looked up from his laptop. "At current market prices, accounting for purity and condition, I calculate $293,400,000. The value has increased due to market appreciation since 1998. David turned to Harold and Margaret. "If we file a whistleblower claim and it's accepted, you'd be entitled to between 10 and 30%. Even at the low end, that's over $29 million. Margaret's hand found Harold's. They didn't speak, couldn't speak. "There's something else," Thomas said. "I did some digging into your situation. Your children, what they did, it might constitute elder financial abuse. That's a federal crime." Harold shook his head. "I don't want revenge. I just want justice." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Thomas replied. A week later, David filed the initial whistleblower complaint with the Department of Energy's Office of Inspector General. It was a careful document, laying out the discovery, the documentation, the legal basis for custodial authority. Then they waited. Harold and Margaret returned to the facility. It had become their home now, strange as that seemed. They'd cleaned up several rooms on the main level, made them livable. Margaret planted herbs in pots near the windows. Harold repaired old furniture and fixed the heating in the living quarters. They didn't talk much about what might happen. The waiting was its own kind of torture. 6 weeks passed. Then one morning Harold heard vehicles on the access road. His heart seized. He ran to the window and saw 3 black SUVs pulling up to the facility entrance. Men in suits emerged, carrying briefcases and badges. "Margaret?" Harold called. She appeared from the kitchen, her face pale. "Who is it?" "The government." They held hands as heavy footsteps approached the entrance. A knock, firm and official. Harold opened the door. A woman stood there, mid-50s, with steel-grey hair and an expression that gave nothing away. She held up a badge. "Harold and Margaret, I'm Agent Ellen with the Department of Energy, Office of Inspector General. We need to talk about your whistleblower complaint." Harold stepped aside. "Come in." 5 agents entered, along with 2 people in civilian clothes who introduced themselves as government auditors. They filled the small administrative office, their presence overwhelming. Ellen sat down across from Harold and Margaret. "We've reviewed your complaint. We've examined the documentation you provided, and we've run background checks on both of you." Harold's throat was dry. "And?" Ellen's expression softened slightly. "And we owe you an apology. What you found, what you documented, it represents one of the most significant failures in federal asset management we've ever encountered." "You believe us?" Margaret asked. "We verified everything, sent our own team into the vault last week while you were away." Harold stiffened. "You were here?" "We had to confirm, but everything you reported is accurate." Ellen pulled out a folder. "Here's where we are. The materials are federal property. That's not in dispute. But the circumstances of their abandonment, combined with your legitimate custodial authority and the fact that you reported them rather than attempting to remove them, puts you in a unique position." "What does that mean?" Harold asked. "It means we're prepared to offer you a settlement under the Whistleblower Protection Act. Normally, rewards range from 10 to 30%. Given the extraordinary value and the circumstances, we're authorized to offer 15%. Marcus, the accountant, had calculated the exact value. $293,400,000. 15% of that was $44,010,000. The number hung in the air like something impossible. Margaret's hand tightened around Harold's. "There are conditions," Ellen continued. "You'll sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. The facility and its contents will be properly secured and transferred to federal custody. You'll cooperate fully with our investigation into how this happened, and you'll make no public statements without approval." "And if we refuse?" Harold asked, though he didn't know why. Ellen smiled slightly. "Then this becomes complicated, lengthy, and expensive. Litigation could take years. You'd face government scrutiny, and in the end, you'd likely get less or nothing at all." She pushed a document across the table. "This is a fair offer for an extraordinary situation. My recommendation is that you take it." Harold looked at Margaret. She looked back at him, tears forming in her eyes. $44 million, after being left with nothing, after being betrayed and discarded, after spending weeks living in an abandoned facility. They had found something nobody else remembered. And now the government was offering them more money than they'd ever imagined. Harold turned to Ellen. "We'll need to discuss this with our lawyer." "Of course, you have 72 hours. The agents left, their vehicles disappearing down the mountain road. Harold and Margaret sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Margaret spoke. "It's real, isn't it? We're really going to be okay?" Harold pulled her close, his face buried in her white hair. "Yes," he whispered, "we're going to be okay." David Chen arrived at the facility the next morning, his car kicking up dust on the old access road. Harold met him at the entrance, looking exhausted. They hadn't slept. 44 million. David said, settling into a chair in the administrative office. That's a substantial offer. Is it fair? Margaret asked. David pulled out his laptop and opened a spreadsheet. Based on the total value and standard whistleblower percentages, yes, 15% is above average for this type of case. They're motivated to settle quickly and quietly. Why? Harold asked. Because this is embarrassing. Nearly 300 million in strategic materials, forgotten for 26 years. That's a headline the Department of Energy doesn't want. They'd rather pay you to go away than have this become public. Harold stared out the window at the mountains. What if we said no? David leaned back. Then we fight. We could argue for 20 or even 30%, but it would take years. Depositions, hearings, motions, and the government has infinite resources and patience. They could drag this out until you're both too old or too tired to care. Margaret's voice was quiet. We're already old and tired. Exactly, David said gently. This offer gives you security now, today. You can rebuild your lives, get proper housing, medical care, maybe even hold your children accountable for what they did. Harold turned from the window. What do you mean, hold them accountable? Elder financial abuse. Thomas, the Inspector General, he looked into the documents your children had you sign. There are irregularities, signatures on forms you don't remember seeing, transfers that happened without proper notification. If we wanted to pursue it, there's a case. Harold sat down heavily. I don't want to destroy my children. They tried to destroy you, David replied. They took your home, your savings, your dignity. They dumped you in a substandard facility and disappeared. They're still my children. Margaret placed her hand on Harold's shoulder. Maybe they need to face consequences. Maybe that's the only way they'll understand what they did. Harold was quiet for a long time. Then he looked up at David. If we accept the settlement, can we still pursue the abuse case? Yes, they're separate matters. The whistleblower settlement is between you and the federal government. The abuse case would be criminal or civil action against your children. How long before we have to decide on the settlement? Ellen gave you 72 hours. That leaves us 48. Harold nodded slowly. Then we have time to think. That afternoon, Harold walked the facility alone. He'd spent so many years here, so much of his life inside these concrete walls. He'd been young once, fresh from the Air Force, eager to serve his country in a different way. He'd believed the work mattered, that he was contributing to something important. And maybe he had been. But the government had forgotten him just as easily as they'd forgotten the vault. He was expendable. His decades of service, his loyalty, his silence about classified projects, none of it had earned him anything more than a modest severance and a handshake. Now they wanted to pay him to stay quiet again. Harold found himself in the vault, standing among the containers. He opened one randomly. Rare earth elements, precisely measured and labeled. Materials that powered modern technology, cell phones, computers, satellites, worth millions, forgotten in the dark. Like him, except he'd found his way back to the light. That evening, Margaret cooked dinner in the facility's small kitchen. She'd found canned goods in the emergency supplies, made a simple stew. They ate together in the break room, the same room where Harold had first told her about the fourth level. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked. "About justice," Harold said, "about what that word really means." "And what does it mean?" Harold set down his spoon. "I think it means making things right. Not revenge, not punishment, just balance. They took from us. Now we have the chance to take something back, not just money, but dignity. The right to say we stood up and fought." Margaret nodded. "So we accept the settlement?" "Yes, but we don't stop there. We use the resources to hold Daniel, Christine, and Robert accountable. We help other people who've been thrown away by their families. We make this mean something." Margaret's eyes glistened. "When did you get so wise?" Harold smiled faintly. I've had a lot of time to think lately." They called David that night and told him their decision. The next morning, he arrived with the settlement documents. $44,010,000 in exchange for their cooperation, their silence, and their legal release of any claim to the materials. Harold signed his name slowly, carefully. Margaret signed beside him. It was done. Ellen and her team returned 2 days later with trucks, equipment, and armed security. They would be removing the materials over the next several weeks, transporting them to a secure federal facility. Harold and Margaret were allowed to stay during the process, observing, ensuring everything was handled properly. Watching the containers being loaded and hauled away felt strange, like saying goodbye to something that had never really been theirs, but had changed their lives nonetheless. On the third day of the removal operation, Harold heard a commotion at the facility entrance. He walked to the security station and saw 3 people arguing with the guards: Daniel, Christine, and Robert. His children had found them. Harold's chest tightened. He hadn't seen them since the day they'd dropped him and Margaret at the nursing facility, hadn't heard their voices except through cold emails and brief text messages. Now here they were, demanding entry. "I'm sorry, sir," one of the guards was saying. "This is a federal operation. No unauthorized personnel." "That's my father in there," Daniel shouted. "I have a right to see him." Harold stepped forward. "Let them in." The guard looked uncertain. "Sir," Agent Ellen said, "it's fine. They're my children." The guard stepped aside reluctantly. Daniel, Christine, and Robert walked through, their faces a mixture of anger and false concern. Daniel spoke first. "Dad, what the hell is going on? We got a call from some government agency asking questions about you and Mom. They said you filed some kind of complaint." Harold crossed his arms. "Did they also tell you what the complaint was about?" Christine, always the lawyer, stepped forward. "They said you claimed to have found abandoned federal property. Dad, are you being scammed? Is someone taking advantage of you?" Harold almost laughed. The irony was staggering. "No one's taking advantage of me, Christine. Not anymore." "What's that supposed to mean?" Robert asked. Margaret appeared behind Harold, her presence steadying him. "It means we know what you did," she said quietly. "All of you." Daniel's expression shifted. "Mom, we were trying to help." "You stole our house," Margaret interrupted, her voice stronger now. "You drained our savings. You put us in a terrible facility and abandoned us." "That's not true," Christine said. "We were protecting your assets." "From who?" Harold asked. "From us?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Then Daniel tried a different approach. "Look, I know things got complicated. There were legal issues, tax considerations. Maybe we didn't communicate well, but we can work this out. We're family." "You're right," Harold said. "We are family, which is why what you did hurts so much more." Robert, the youngest, looked down at his feet. There was something in his expression, shame maybe, or regret. "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have said something. I knew it wasn't right. But Daniel and Christine, they said it was the best way to handle things." "Don't put this on us," Christine snapped. "We all agreed." "You agreed," Robert said. "I went along because I didn't want to cause problems." "Well, there are problems now," Harold said. "The government is investigating you, all 3 of you. Elder financial abuse is a federal crime." The color drained from Christine's face. "You can't be serious." "We didn't file the complaint," Margaret said. "The Inspector General discovered the irregularities during their investigation of us. Once they found evidence of abuse, they were obligated to pursue it." Daniel stepped forward, his tone turning aggressive. "So what? You found some old government stuff, reported it for a reward, and now you're trying to destroy your own children?" "We're trying to get justice," Harold said calmly. "There's a difference." "Justice?" Daniel's face reddened. "You think it's justice to ruin our lives? Christine could lose her law license. I could lose my real estate credentials. Robert's business could be shut down. And for what? Because you're mad we tried to help you." Harold's voice dropped to something cold and final. "You didn't try to help. You tried to erase us. You sold our home out from under us. You took money we'd saved for 45 years. You left us in a facility that smelled like death and despair, and then you disappeared." "We had our own lives," Christine said defensively. "And we understood that," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "We never asked you to stop living. We just asked you not to forget we existed." Christine opened her mouth to respond but stopped. Somewhere beneath the lawyer persona, beneath the justifications and rationalizations, something cracked. "I'm sorry," Robert said suddenly, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. You're right. We were wrong. All of it was wrong." Daniel turned on him. "Robert, shut up. Don't admit to anything." "Why not?" Robert shot back. "It's true. We took advantage of them. We convinced ourselves it was for their own good, but really it was just easier than actually taking care of them." "Taking care of us?" Harold said. "We didn't need you to take care of us. We needed you to love us, to visit, to call, to remember we were your parents." Christine's professional facade crumbled. She sat down heavily on a nearby crate, her head in her hands. "What do you want from us?" Harold and Margaret looked at each other. They talked about this possibility, rehearsed what they might say. But now, faced with their children's broken expressions, the prepared speech felt hollow. "We want you to face consequences," Harold said finally. "Real ones, not because we hate you, but because what you did was wrong, and wrong things need to be made right." "So you're going to let them prosecute us?" Daniel asked. "That's not our decision anymore," Margaret said. "It's the government's, but we won't stand in their way." "And what about the money?" Christine asked. "The settlement you're getting. Are you going to share it with us?" Harold stared at her, stunned. "You're still thinking about money?" "I'm thinking about fairness," Christine said. "If you get $44 million, we should be entitled to something. We're your children." And there it was, the ugly truth laid bare. Even now, even after everything, they saw their parents as assets to be managed, resources to be extracted. Harold turned away. "Get out." "Dad, I said get out. You're not welcome here. You're not welcome in our lives until you understand what you did and why it was unforgivable." Daniel started to argue, but the federal guards had moved closer, their hands resting on their weapons. The message was clear. The three siblings left, Christine and Daniel still arguing, Robert trailing behind with his shoulders slumped. Harold and Margaret stood together, watching them go. "Do you think they'll ever understand?" Margaret asked. "I don't know," Harold replied. "But it's not our job to make them anymore. We spent our whole lives trying to be good parents. Maybe it's time we focused on being good to ourselves." Over the next several weeks, as the vault was emptied and secured, Harold and Margaret worked with David and his team to build the abuse case. The evidence was damning. Forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, accounts drained without notification. Thomas, the Inspector General, turned everything over to the Justice Department. 3 months after the settlement was finalized, federal prosecutors filed charges against all 3 siblings: conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, fraud, and theft. Christine lost her law license pending trial. Daniel's real estate business collapsed under the weight of investigation. Robert, who cooperated fully and testified against his siblings, received a plea deal, 5 years probation and full restitution of the stolen funds. Daniel and Christine went to trial. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing came on a grey morning in March. Harold and Margaret sat in the courtroom, holding hands, as the judge addressed Daniel and Christine. "What you did to your parents represents a fundamental betrayal of trust," the judge said. "You didn't just steal money. You stole dignity, security, and the peace they'd earned after a lifetime of hard work. Elder abuse is not just a crime against individuals. It's a crime against the values we claim to hold as a society. Daniel received 4 years in federal prison. Christine received 3 years. Both were ordered to pay full restitution, which would be garnished from any future earnings for the rest of their lives. As the bailiffs led them away, Christine looked back at Harold and Margaret. Her expression was hard to read. Anger, regret, defiance, sadness, all mixed together. Harold met her eyes, but said nothing. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. The case had drawn national attention, not just because of the dollar amounts, but because it touched something raw in the American consciousness, the fear of being abandoned by the people you'd sacrificed everything for. David handled the press, reading a brief statement Harold and Margaret had prepared. This case was never about revenge. It was about justice and accountability. Harold and Margaret hope their story will help other families recognize the signs of elder abuse and empower seniors to stand up for themselves. The cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. But Harold and Margaret had already disappeared into a waiting car. They were done performing for others. With the settlement money, Harold and Margaret bought their old house back. The developers who'd purchased it were eager to sell when Harold offered $50,000 over asking price. They paid in cash. The house needed work. New roof, updated electrical, fresh paint. Harold hired contractors, but did much of the work himself, rediscovering the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. Margaret planted her garden again, the same flowers she'd grown for 47 years. Tulips in spring, roses in summer, chrysanthemums in fall. They hired a lawyer to create a foundation, the Harold and Margaret Foundation for Elder Justice. Its mission was simple: provide legal assistance, housing support, and advocacy for seniors who'd been victimized by family members or institutions. The Foundation's first case was a 73-year-old woman whose son had stolen her pension. The second was an 81-year-old man whose daughter had him declared incompetent to seize his property. Within a year, they'd helped 67 people. Harold also established a scholarship fund for children of federal employees, particularly those who'd worked in classified positions and been forgotten by the system that employed them. 20 students received full college scholarships in the first year. But perhaps the most meaningful thing they did was simpler. They opened their home. Every Sunday, Harold and Margaret hosted dinner for people who had nowhere else to go. Seniors from the community, veterans, people who'd been abandoned or forgotten. Sometimes 5 people came, sometimes 20. Margaret cooked, Harold told stories, and for a few hours each week, their dining room became a place where people who felt invisible could be seen again. Robert came to one of these dinners 6 months after his sentencing. He stood at the door, uncertain, until Margaret pulled him into a hug. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I know," Margaret said. "Come in." It wasn't forgiveness, not completely. The wound was too deep for that, but it was a beginning, a tentative step toward something that might eventually become reconciliation. Daniel and Christine never came. Christine sent a letter from prison, carefully worded and legally cautious. Daniel sent nothing. Harold and Margaret accepted this. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Some relationships, once broken, stay broken. And that's okay. Healing doesn't require reconciliation. It requires acceptance. 1 year after the settlement, Ellen from the Inspector General's office visited Harold and Margaret at their home. She brought news. The vault materials had been properly transferred and integrated into the strategic reserve. The facility itself was being preserved as a historical site, a reminder of Cold War infrastructure and the importance of institutional memory. "There's something else," Ellen said, pulling out a folder. "We completed our investigation into how the materials were forgotten. It was worse than we thought. Over 50 similar sites were improperly decommissioned between 1995 and 2005. Your discovery triggered a comprehensive audit. We've recovered over $800 million in abandoned assets." Harold whistled low. "Because we reported it?" "Because you reported it. If you'd tried to hide it or sell it off quietly, none of this would have been discovered. "So honesty pays," Margaret said with a slight smile. Ellen smiled back. "Sometimes, not always, but in this case, yes." She handed Harold the folder. Inside was a letter from the Secretary of Energy thanking him for his decades of service and his integrity in reporting the discovery. Attached to the letter was a certificate, Meritorious Civilian Service Award. Harold stared at it, something catching in his throat. "You okay?" Margaret asked. Harold nodded. "I spent 33 years working for them, and they forgot me. But now, at the end, they're saying thank you." "Better late than never," Ellen said. Harold carefully folded the certificate and placed it in the folder. "No," he said quietly. "Better would have been remembering in the first place, but I'll take it." As autumn arrived and the aspens turned gold on the mountain slopes, Harold and Margaret settled into their new life. It wasn't the retirement they'd imagined when they were younger, but it was good. It was theirs. They had enough money to never worry again, enough resources to help others, enough time, finally, to simply be. Some mornings, Harold would drive up to the facility. The government had given him a permanent access pass, a small courtesy recognizing his role in its preservation. He'd walk the empty corridors, remembering his younger self, the man who'd believed in service and sacrifice. He still believed in those things. But now he believed in something else, too. That service shouldn't require self-erasure. That sacrifice shouldn't mean being forgotten. And that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. Margaret would sometimes join him on these trips. They'd sit together in the old break room, drinking coffee from a thermos, watching dust motes drift through the pale light. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked one day. Fighting back instead of just accepting what happened. Harold thought about it. No. Even if we'd lost everything, even if the government had prosecuted us instead of helping us, I wouldn't regret trying. We spent too many years being invisible, being forgotten. I'm glad we made noise. Margaret leaned against him. Me too. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd survived betrayal, poverty, abandonment, and fought their way back to dignity. The story could have ended there, in that quiet moment of peace. But life doesn't work in neat endings. 3 years after the settlement, Harold stood in front of a crowd of 200 people gathered in the Pine Ridge Community Center. It was the annual gala for the Harold and Margaret Foundation for Elder Justice, and he was expected to say a few words. Public speaking had never been his strength, but Margaret sat in the front row, her encouraging smile giving him courage. "When my wife and I were betrayed by our children," Harold began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "We thought our lives were over. We had no home, no savings, no dignity. We were invisible people, thrown away by the ones we loved most." He paused, looking around the room at faces young and old, all watching him intently. "But what we discovered in that mountain, it wasn't just valuable materials. It was proof that forgotten things can still matter, that abandoned people can still fight back, that it's never too late to stand up and say, 'This is wrong and I deserve better.'" Applause rippled through the room. "In 3 years, our foundation has helped over 300 seniors reclaim their lives from family members who exploited them. We've recovered $14 million in stolen assets. We've helped prosecute 62 cases of elder abuse. But more than that, we've reminded people that getting old doesn't mean you stop mattering." Harold looked directly at Margaret. "My wife and I, we're not special. We're just two people who got tired of being invisible. And if our story helps even one person find the courage to fight back, then everything we went through was worth it." The crowd rose to their feet, applause washing over him like a wave. Harold stepped down from the podium, his legs shaky, and Margaret met him with a hug. "You did beautifully," she whispered. Among the crowd was a woman in her late 60s, tears streaming down her face. Her name was Dorothy, and she approached Harold and Margaret after the speeches ended. I need to tell you something, Dorothy said, her voice trembling. 6 months ago, my daughter convinced me to sign over my house. She said it was for estate planning. Then she sold it and put me in a facility. I didn't know what to do. I thought I was trapped. Margaret took Dorothy's hands. What happened? I saw you on the news, heard about your foundation. I called the hotline and your lawyers helped me. We got my house back. My daughter is being prosecuted, and for the first time in months, I feel like a person again. Dorothy broke down completely. Margaret pulled her into an embrace while Harold stood by, his eyes wet. This was why they'd fought. Not for the money, though the money made it possible. They fought so that people like Dorothy could see themselves in Harold and Margaret's story and realize they weren't alone. The Foundation's work had attracted national attention. Media outlets ran features on Harold and Margaret, framing them as unlikely heroes who'd exposed government waste and family betrayal. But Harold and Margaret avoided most interview requests, preferring to let their work speak for itself. They did agree to one interview with a documentary filmmaker named Sarah, who was creating a film about elder abuse in America. She spent weeks with them, filming their daily routines, their foundation work, their quiet moments at home. One afternoon, Sarah asked the question everyone wondered: do you hate your children? Harold and Margaret sat together on their porch swing, the same swing Harold had rebuilt when they first moved back into the house. No, Margaret said after a long pause. Hate takes too much energy, and I don't have energy to waste on people who don't want to be in our lives. Do you miss them? Sarah pressed. Harold nodded slowly. I miss who I thought they were. I miss the children I raised, the ones who used to climb on my lap and ask me to fix their toys. But those children grew into adults I don't recognize, adults who chose money over family, and I can't miss people who never really existed. What about Robert? Sarah asked. He cooperated with prosecutors, showed remorse. Have you reconciled? Margaret glanced at Harold. Robert had been coming to Sunday dinners for almost a year now, slowly rebuilding trust. It was awkward, painful, full of silences that said more than words. But it was something. Robert is trying, Margaret said carefully. He made terrible choices, but he owned them. He didn't hide behind excuses or lawyers. That matters. And the others? Harold's jaw tightened. Daniel is still in prison. He writes letters sometimes, but they're full of self-pity and blame. He still thinks he was justified. Christine got out last year. She moved to Oregon, started over. She sent one letter saying she was sorry, but it felt rehearsed, like something her therapist told her to do. Do you think you'll ever forgive them? Harold looked at Margaret, then back at Sarah. Forgiveness isn't something you give all at once. It's something you work toward, day by day, if both sides are willing to do the work. Robert is doing the work, the others aren't. So I forgive Robert a little more each week. The others maybe someday, but not today. The documentary premiered at a film festival in Austin 18 months later. Harold and Margaret flew down for the screening, their first time on an airplane in over a decade. The theater was packed, and watching their story unfold on screen felt surreal, like watching someone else's life. When the credits rolled, the audience stood and applauded. Questions followed, and Harold found himself telling the story again, but this time to people who understood its larger meaning. A young woman in the audience raised her hand. My grandmother is being pressured by my uncle to sign over her property. Your story made me realize I need to help her fight back. What should I do? Harold smiled. Call our foundation. That's exactly why we exist. 3 more people approached after the screening with similar stories. Sarah, the filmmaker, pulled Harold aside. You've started a movement. People are waking up to this issue because of you. Harold shook his head. We didn't start anything. We just stopped being quiet. But Sarah was right. In the months following the documentary's release, reports of elder financial abuse increased dramatically, not because abuse was rising, but because victims were finally speaking up. Harold and Margaret's foundation received over 2,000 calls in 3 months, more than they could handle. They hired more staff, opened satellite offices in 3 states, partnered with legal aid societies and senior advocacy groups. What had started as 2 people fighting for their own dignity had become a nationwide effort to protect vulnerable seniors. Harold turned 75 that spring. Margaret threw him a party at their house, inviting everyone who'd been part of their journey. David Chen, the lawyer who'd taken their case when no one else would. Patricia, the metallurgist who'd verified the vault materials. Thomas, the inspector general who'd helped build their case. Ellen from the Department of Energy. Dozens of people from the foundation, seniors they'd helped, volunteers who'd given their time. And Robert, who brought his wife and kids. The grandchildren, now teenagers, barely remembered Harold and Margaret from before the betrayal. They'd been told their grandparents were difficult, unstable, not worth visiting. Now they sat awkwardly on the couch, unsure how to act. Harold approached them gently. "You're taller than I remember," he said to his grandson James. James looked uncomfortable. "Yeah, I'm 16 now." "Your dad tells me you're interested in engineering." "Yeah, I guess." Harold pulled out his phone and showed James photos of the facility, the vault, the materials they'd discovered. James's eyes widened. "Wait, you actually found all that?" "We did. And the government just forgot about it?" "They did." James looked at Harold with new respect. "That's actually pretty cool." It was a small moment, but it mattered. These kids had been taught to dismiss their grandparents, and now they were seeing Harold and Margaret as real people with real stories. Margaret spent time with her granddaughter, Emily, showing her the garden, teaching her the names of flowers. Emily, 17 and guarded, slowly softened as Margaret shared stories of planting this same garden decades ago, of raising 3 children in this house, of the life that had been stolen and then reclaimed. "My dad said you guys were mean to him," Emily said quietly. Margaret paused, her hands in the soil. "Did he tell you what he did to us?" Emily shook her head. And so Margaret told her, not with anger or bitterness, but with honesty. She explained the betrayal, the stolen house, the depleted savings, the terrible facility. She explained what it felt like to be abandoned by the people you'd sacrificed everything for. When she finished, Emily was crying. "I didn't know," she whispered. "He never told us." "People rarely tell the parts of the story that make them look bad," Margaret said gently. "But you're old enough to hear the truth now. And the truth is, your father made choices that hurt us deeply. We still love him, but love doesn't mean forgetting what happened." By the time the party wound down and Robert's family left, something had shifted. The grandchildren hugged Harold and Margaret goodbye, real hugs, not the obligatory kind. "Can we come back?" James asked. "Any time," Harold said. After everyone had gone and the house was quiet again, Harold and Margaret sat on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. "Do you think Robert will ever really change?" Margaret asked. "I think he's trying," Harold replied. "That's all we can ask." "And the grandkids?" "They're not responsible for their parents' sins. They deserve a chance to know us." Margaret leaned her head on Harold's shoulder. "We've built something good here, haven't we?" Harold looked around at the house they'd reclaimed, the life they'd rebuilt, the foundation that bore their name. "Yes," he said, "we have." But the journey wasn't over. 4 years after the settlement, Harold received a letter. The return address was a prison in Texas, Daniel. Harold almost threw it away. He'd received dozens of letters from Daniel over the years, all following the same pattern: self-justification, minimal apology, requests for money or support. He'd stopped reading them. But something made him open this one. The handwriting was different, less aggressive, more uncertain. "Dad," it began, "I know you have no reason to read this. I know I've sent you empty apologies before, but something happened last week that I need to tell you about." Harold almost stopped there, but continued. There's a guy in here, Marcus, 71 years old, got convicted of fraud. He was in business with his son, and when things went bad, the son blamed everything on him. Marcus took the fall for crimes he didn't commit because he loved his son and thought he was protecting him. Last week, Marcus died. Heart attack in the yard. And before he died, he asked me to contact his son, to tell him he forgave him, that he loved him no matter what. I called the number Marcus gave me. His son answered, and I told him what Marcus wanted him to know. And you know what the son said? He said, "Tell the old man I don't care. He got what he deserved." I hung up and I cried. Not for Marcus, though I cried for him too. I cried because I realized that's who I am. I'm the son who destroyed his father and didn't care. And Marcus, he died in prison, and his last thought was still trying to reach the son who betrayed him. Dad, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even deserve it. But I need you to know I finally understand what I did. Not just the legal stuff, the theft and fraud. I understand that I broke something sacred. You and Mom gave me life, raised me, sacrificed for me, and I repaid you by treating you like assets to be liquidated. There's a chaplain here who talks about redemption. He says it's never too late to change. I don't know if that's true, but I'm trying. I've been working in the prison library, helping older inmates who can't read well. It's not much, but it's something. I'm not asking you to write back. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that somewhere in the son who hurt you, there's still a piece of the boy you raised, and that piece is ashamed and sorry and trying to be better. Your son, Daniel. Harold read the letter 3 times. Then he handed it to Margaret. She read it slowly, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she folded it carefully and placed it on the table between them. What do you think? Harold asked. I think he's in pain, Margaret said. Whether that pain leads to real change, I don't know. People can be sorry and still not change. Should I write back? Margaret was quiet for a long time. That's your decision, but if you do, be honest. Don't give him false hope if you're not ready for reconciliation. Harold thought about it for 3 days. Finally, he sat down and wrote a response. Daniel, he wrote, I received your letter. I appreciate your honesty, but honesty after you've been caught and punished is different than honesty when you still have something to lose. You say you understand what you did. I hope that's true. But understanding and atonement are not the same thing. Marcus's son broke his father's heart. You broke mine and your mother's. The difference is, we're still alive, which means you still have a chance to make amends, not with words, but with actions. When you get out of prison in 2 years, you'll have a choice. You can go back to who you were, making excuses and blaming others. Or you can become someone new, someone who earns back trust through years of consistent, honest effort. If you choose the second path, the door to our home isn't locked. But you'll have to prove you've changed, and that proof can't come in letters. It has to come in how you live your life. Your father, Harold. He mailed the letter and told Margaret what he'd written. Do you think he'll change? She asked. I don't know, Harold admitted, but I gave him a chance. What he does with it is up to him. 6 months later, Christine reached out, not with a letter, but through Robert. She'd been living in Portland, working as a paralegal under an assumed name since her release from prison. She couldn't practice law anymore, her license permanently revoked, and she'd struggled to find work once background checks revealed her conviction. Robert called Harold one evening. Christine wants to see you and Mum. She's scared to reach out directly. She thinks you hate her. Harold sighed. We don't hate her, but we don't trust her either. She's different, Dad. Prison changed her. Losing everything changed her. She volunteers at a senior center now, helping elderly people with legal paperwork, stuff she can do without a license. That's good, Harold said neutrally. "Will you see her?" Harold looked at Margaret, who'd been listening on speakerphone. She nodded slowly. "Tell her she can come to Sunday dinner," Harold said. "But Robert, make sure she understands this isn't forgiveness. It's just a conversation." Christine arrived on a rainy Sunday in October, driving up in a beat-up Honda Civic that looked nothing like the luxury cars she used to favor. She was thinner than Harold remembered, her hair showing grey she no longer bothered to color. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, no jewelry, no designer labels. She stood on the porch for a full minute before knocking. Margaret opened the door. The two women stared at each other, years of hurt and betrayal hanging between them like fog. "Hi, Mom," Christine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come in," Margaret replied. They sat in the living room, the same room where Christine had once spread out trust documents and convinced her parents to sign away their home. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Harold and Margaret sat together on the couch. Christine perched on the edge of a chair, looking like she might bolt at any moment. Robert sat nearby, a bridge between the two sides. "Thank you for seeing me," Christine said. "I wasn't sure you would." "We almost didn't," Harold said honestly. Christine nodded. "I understand. I wouldn't want to see me either." A long silence stretched out. Finally, Christine spoke again. "I've practiced what I wanted to say 1,000 times. I had speeches prepared, explanations, justifications. But sitting here now, all of that feels hollow." She looked directly at Harold and Margaret. "There's nothing I can say that makes what I did okay. I stole from you. I lied to you. I abandoned you. And I did it because I'd convinced myself that I knew better, that I was protecting you from yourselves, that I had the right to make decisions about your life." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "But the truth is, I did it because it was convenient, because dealing with aging parents is hard and uncomfortable, and it was easier to warehouse you somewhere and forget about you. I treated you like a problem to be solved instead of people I loved." Margaret's hand tightened around Harold's. "Prison gave me a lot of time to think," Christine continued. "I lost everything, my career, my reputation, my freedom, and I kept thinking, this isn't fair, I was just trying to help. But then I met other women inside, women who'd done terrible things and couldn't see it, and I realized I was just like them, blind to my own cruelty." She wiped her eyes. "There was this older woman, Ruth, 76 years old, in for writing bad checks to pay for her medications. Her daughter had stolen her pension, and Ruth was too proud to ask for help, so she committed fraud to survive. And one day Ruth said to me, 'My daughter did to me what you did to your parents, and now we're both in prison. Difference is, I'm here because of what she did. You're here because of what you did.'" Christine's voice cracked. "And that broke something in me, because Ruth was right. I did this. Not Daniel, not Robert, me. I was the lawyer. I drafted the documents. I knew they were wrong, and I did them anyway." Harold leaned forward. "Why are you telling us this?" "Because I want you to know that I see what I did, really see it. Not the legal version where I violated statutes and committed fraud. The human version where I betrayed the people who gave me life and loved me unconditionally." "And what do you want from us?" Margaret asked quietly. Christine shook her head. "Nothing. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect you to let me back into your lives. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry. And that I'm trying to become someone worthy of being your daughter again, even if that takes the rest of my life." Harold and Margaret sat in silence, processing. Robert watched nervously, clearly hoping for some sign of reconciliation. Finally, Harold spoke. "Christine, I appreciate you coming here. I appreciate your honesty, but you need to understand something. Sorry doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't give us back the months we spent in that terrible facility. It doesn't erase the fear and humiliation we felt when we realized our own children had thrown us away." Christine nodded, more tears falling. "But," Harold continued, It's a start. Robert has been coming to Sunday dinners for 2 years now. He's shown up week after week, even when it's uncomfortable. He's let us get to know our grandchildren again. He's proven through his actions that he's changed. Harold looked at Christine directly. If you want to rebuild a relationship with us, it's going to take time. Years, probably. And it's going to require you to keep showing up, keep being honest, keep doing the work. I will, Christine said. However long it takes. Margaret spoke for the first time since Christine's speech. You hurt me more than anyone ever has. You were my only daughter. I held you when you were born, stayed up nights when you were sick, watched you graduate law school with so much pride, and you looked me in the eye and lied to me while you stole everything I had. Christine's face crumpled. But, Margaret continued, her voice shaking, you're still my daughter, and if you're willing to do the work, to really change, then I'm willing to see where that leads. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was a door left slightly open, a possibility where before there had only been a wall. Christine left an hour later, after a stilted conversation where they discussed neutral topics: Christine's paralegal work, Harold and Margaret's foundation, the weather. Small talk that felt enormous because it was happening at all. When she was gone, Harold and Margaret sat together in the quiet house. Did we do the right thing? Margaret asked. I don't know, Harold said. But we did the honest thing. We didn't pretend everything was fine, but we didn't slam the door completely. Now it's up to her to prove she meant what she said. Over the next year, Christine came to Sunday dinners twice a month. The conversations remained careful, guarded, but slowly small pieces of trust began to rebuild. She sent thoughtful cards on birthdays. She called once a week just to check in, never asking for anything, just listening. Harold and Margaret watched carefully, looking for signs that this was manipulation, a long game to get access to their money. But months passed, and Christine never asked for financial help. She drove her beat-up car, lived in a modest apartment, worked her paralegal job, and volunteered her free time helping seniors. When Harold's foundation expanded to Portland, Christine was one of the first volunteers. She used her legal knowledge to help elderly victims of financial abuse navigate the same system she'd once exploited. Isn't it weird? Margaret asked Harold one night. Having her work for the foundation? Yeah, Harold admitted. But maybe that's exactly what atonement looks like, using the skills that hurt people to now help them. Daniel was released from prison on a cold morning in February. He'd served his full sentence, no early release, no parole. He walked out of the Texas facility with nothing but the clothes on his back and a bus ticket to Colorado Springs, where Robert had offered him a job on a construction crew. Harold and Margaret didn't go to meet him. That felt like too much, too soon. But Robert kept them updated. He's different, Robert reported. Quiet, humble. He's living in a halfway house, working construction, going to counseling twice a week. He asked about you and Mum, but I told him he needs to focus on rebuilding his own life first. That's good advice, Harold said. 3 months after his release, Daniel wrote another letter. This one was shorter. Dad and Mum, it read. I'm out. I'm working. I'm trying to be better. I'm not asking to see you. I know I haven't earned that, but I want you to know that everything you said in your letter was right, and I'm trying to prove through actions that I've changed. Maybe someday you'll believe me. But even if you never do, I'll keep trying anyway, because it's the right thing to do, not because I expect a reward. Your son, Daniel. Harold put the letter in a drawer with all the others. He didn't respond immediately. He wanted to see if Daniel would keep trying even without acknowledgement. 6 months passed. Daniel kept working construction. He got his own apartment. He started volunteering at a prison ministry, going back into the facility where he'd served time to mentor younger inmates. Robert brought Harold and Margaret updates, and slowly, grudgingly, Harold began to believe his oldest son might actually be changing. In the fall, 7 years after the initial betrayal, Harold turned 78. Margaret threw another party, smaller this time, just close friends and family. Robert came with his wife and kids. Christine drove down from Portland. And at the last minute, Harold invited Daniel. When Daniel arrived, the room went quiet. He stood in the doorway of the house he'd helped steal, looking at the parents he'd betrayed, and his face showed everything: shame, regret, hope, fear. Harold walked to him. They stood face to face, two men who shared blood and so much pain. "Hi, Dad," Daniel said quietly. "Hi, son," Harold replied. They didn't hug, didn't embrace, just stood there acknowledging each other's presence. It was enough. The party continued awkwardly at first. Daniel sat quietly in the corner, speaking only when spoken to. But gradually, as the evening progressed, small conversations happened. Margaret asked about his job. He asked about the foundation. Christine told him about her volunteer work. And Harold watched it all, this broken family trying to find its way back to something resembling wholeness. Late in the evening, after most guests had left, Harold's 3 children sat together in the living room with their parents. It was the first time they'd all been in the same room since the trial, and the weight of history pressed down on all of them. "I want to say something," Robert began. "We all messed up, some more than others, but we all failed you. And I know sorry isn't enough, but I'm grateful you gave me a chance to prove I could be better. And I'm grateful you're giving Daniel and Christine that same chance." Daniel spoke next. "I destroyed this family. I know that, and I know it might never be fixed. But I'm committed to spending the rest of my life trying to earn back even a fraction of the trust I broke." Christine nodded. "Me too. You didn't have to let any of us back into your lives. The fact that you did, it's more grace than we deserve." Harold looked at his children, these adults he'd raised, who'd hurt him so deeply and were now trying, however imperfectly, to make amends. "Here's what I've learned," Harold said. "Forgiveness isn't a light switch. You don't flip it and suddenly everything's fine. It's a process. Some days I feel like I can move forward. Other days the anger and hurt come back just as strong as ever." Margaret nodded. "But we're trying. Because the alternative is spending our final years consumed by bitterness, and we've fought too hard for our peace to let that happen." "So where do we go from here?" Daniel asked. "We keep showing up," Harold said. "All of us. We keep being honest. We keep doing the work. And maybe, eventually, we'll find something that looks like a family again. It won't be what we had before, because that's gone forever. But maybe it can be something new." As the evening ended and his children left, Harold and Margaret stood on their porch watching the cars disappear down the street. "Do you think we'll ever fully trust them again?" Margaret asked. "I don't know," Harold admitted. "But I think we can build something honest, even if it's not the same as what we lost." The foundation continued to grow. By its 8th year, it had helped over 900 families, recovered $43 million in stolen assets, and successfully prosecuted 214 cases of elder abuse. Harold and Margaret stepped back from day-to-day operations, hiring a full-time director and professional staff. But they remained on the board, using their story to advocate for stronger protections for seniors. They testified before Congress twice, pushing for federal legislation that would make elder financial abuse easier to prosecute. The Harold and Margaret Act, as it became known, passed with bipartisan support and was signed into law on Harold's 80th birthday. At the signing ceremony, the president shook Harold's hand and said, "You turned your pain into purpose. That's the American story at its best." Harold smiled politely, but later he told Margaret, "It's not the American story, it's just our story, and we did it because we had no other choice." "We always had a choice," Margaret replied. "We could have stayed broken. We chose to fight." As Harold approached his 82nd birthday, his health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of age, weaker knees, shorter breath, a heart that didn't beat quite as strongly as it used to. Margaret, at 80, remained sharper, but she moved more slowly, her arthritis making every step an effort. They talked about mortality more openly now, about what would happen when one of them passed, about the legacy they'd leave behind. "I used to think legacy was about children and grandchildren," Harold said one evening. "But now I think it's bigger than that. It's about the ripples you create, the lives you touch, the systems you change." "We changed something, didn't we?" Margaret said. "We did. We showed people that being old doesn't mean being powerless, that being betrayed doesn't mean accepting defeat." They sat in comfortable silence, these two people who'd survived abandonment, poverty and betrayal, and built something meaningful from the wreckage. On a crisp October morning, Harold and Margaret drove up to the facility one last time. The government had officially opened it as a historical site, a museum dedicated to Cold War infrastructure and the importance of institutional memory. They walked through the corridors, now cleaned and lit, past exhibits explaining the facility's history. Tourists wandered through, reading plaques and taking photos. They descended to the vault, now empty except for a single display, one of the original containers, opened to show what had been stored there. Beside it, a plaque told their story. Discovered in 2018 by Harold and Margaret, former facility employee and his wife, who reported the abandoned materials rather than attempting to profit from them. Their honesty led to the recovery of nearly $300 million in federal assets and sparked a nationwide conversation about elder abuse and government accountability. Harold read the plaque and smiled. "They made us sound noble." "Weren't we?" Margaret asked. "We were desperate. We just happened to be desperate in the right direction." They stood together in the vault that had changed their lives, surrounded by tourists who had no idea the elderly couple beside them were the heroes of the story. And that felt right somehow. They'd never wanted fame. They'd wanted justice, dignity, and the chance to make their suffering mean something. They'd gotten all three. As they drove home that evening, the mountains turning purple in the fading light, Harold reached over and took Margaret's hand. "No regrets?" he asked. "About what?" "Fighting back, going public, building the foundation. All of it." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Not one. We could have stayed quiet, taken what they gave us, faded away. But we didn't. We stood up, we fought, and we won." "We did," Harold agreed. They drove the rest of the way in silence, two people who discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried in vaults, but found in the courage to demand the dignity you deserve. Anyone can change the world if they're willing to stand up when it would be easier to stay down, if they're willing to fight when it would be safer to accept defeat, if they're willing to believe that their life, their story, their struggle still matters, no matter how old they are or how many times they've been knocked down. As the sun set over Pine Ridge and Harold and Margaret pulled into the driveway of the home they'd lost and reclaimed, they knew their story was more than just their own. It belonged to every person who'd ever been betrayed by those they trusted. Every senior who'd been told they didn't matter anymore. Every voice that had been silenced by power, money, or cruelty. Because Harold and Margaret proved something essential. That forgotten people can still change the world, that abandoned dreams can still come true, that it's never, ever too late to stand up and fight for what you deserve. The elderly couple who'd been left to die in a nursing facility had become warriors for justice. The man who'd spent 33 years in an underground facility had finally brought something precious into the light, and the woman who'd devoted her life to caring for others had learned to care for herself. They didn't just survive betrayal, they transformed it into purpose. They didn't just recover from loss, they built something that would outlast them. And as they walked into their home, surrounded by photos of the hundreds of lives they'd touched through their foundation, they knew the truth. Some people inherit money, some inherit land. But Harold and Margaret inherited something far more valuable, the knowledge that even in our darkest moments, even when everyone has given up on us, we still have the power to write our own ending. Because for Harold and Margaret, and for everyone they inspired, the story isn't over when the world forgets you. It's just beginning when you remember yourself. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories that will move you. Click now to keep discovering what happens when ordinary people do extraordinary things. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that courage, dignity, and justice still matter no matter your age.